looking at today is sensemaking. In his 1995 book, Sensemaking in Organizations, Carl Weick laid out much of the understanding of sensemaking that we have today. Weick had started examining sensemaking 2 decades previous to this in conjunction with what he saw as major disruptions to organizations. One was the Man Gulch fire in 1949, when 12 of 15 firefighters were killed in a forest fire in Montana. The second one was the Tenerife air disaster in the Canary Islands in the 1970s, and the third was the Union Carbide disaster in Bhopal, all major catastrophes for the organizations that were involved. Weick's use of sensemaking is to look at the way that organizations respond to interruptions into the normal routines. These situations introduce ambiguity and uncertainty and have to be resolved in order for the organizations to maintain or to regain equilibrium. Weick was dissatisfied with the, up to that point, monolithic top-down view that information flows from the top from the leaders to the employees, and he didn't think that was adequate to explain how organizations responded to changing situations. Weick established 7 sense-making characteristics. He says the first one, it's grounded in identity construction. That is, that we make sense of our role in organizations because of our identities in those organizations, and we make sense of disruptive events in those organizations based upon how they affect us in our identities. The second is retrospective. That is, that we make sense of what's going on in view of how we've responded to these things. We don't make sense of them at the moment that they're going on, and we don't make sense of them as they are going to occur, but only after they've occurred and how we've responded to these events. The third characteristic, according to Weick, is that sense-making is enactive of sensible environments. And he means that sense-making only has meaning when it's tied to actions that respond to the changes in our organizations. Without action, sense-making has no meaning. The fourth characteristic of sense-making that Weick lays out is that it's social. We create narratives to respond to these changes in our environments, and we create these narratives not only by ourselves, but in conjunction with others. The fifth characteristic that Weick cites as critical to sense-making is that it's ongoing. It's an iterative process. That is, that as we note the changes in our environment, we respond to those changes. And those responses that we choose further change the environment, which means that they might provoke new changes in us and then in our environment. The sixth characteristic of sense-making is that it's focused on and extracted by cues. We are constantly monitoring our environment, and we are sensitive to the changes in that environment. And those changes then provoke in us responses that may further change the environment. The seventh and last characteristic that Weick notes is that our responses to the changes in our environment are driven by plausibility rather than accuracy. In that, he means that we're not looking for the perfect solution, we're looking for a practical solution. And we're looking for a practical solution because we're trying to respond to circumstances in which we don't have the entirety of the information that we need. So we are responding in an ad hoc way and in ways that we hope will be practical, but not necessarily perfect. Weick lays out 4 core constructs as part of the characteristics. One is the environmental cue, that we are responding to the changes that we see in the environment that we understand have to be addressed. The second is a core construct of narrative, that he uses the term intersubjective in the meaning that we are constantly talking with one another in an organization to try and make sense of what's going on. The third is that sense itself. We're trying to create meaning around the changes that are occurring in our environment to see if they require a response by us and what sort of response that might require. And the last one is enactment, to reinforce the idea that sense-making is meaningless without action based upon the sense-making. And that action is to restore equilibrium to the environment that has been disrupted. Weick sees three stages to the process of sense-making. One is creation, that the organization members notice and extract cues from the environment. The second is interpretation, that in conjunction with each other we develop narratives about what the situation is and how we should respond to it. And then the third one is enactment, that we, in response to the changes, in response to the narratives that we construct with each other, we put into action new processes in order to restore equilibrium to the organization. There have been several advancements to Weick's theory of sense-making. The first one by Maitlis. Maitlis lays out 4 forms of organizational sense-making because she says that leadership and stakeholders might react differently to environmental jolts to the organization. If both leadership as well as the stakeholders are actively involved, she says this is guided sense-making. If the organizational leaders are actively involved but stakeholders are not actively involved, she calls this restricted sense-making. If stakeholder groups are actively involved but leadership is not, she calls this fragmented sense-making. And we'll come back to this one then. And the last one is if neither organizational leaders nor stakeholder groups are actively involved, she says that this becomes minimal sense-making. Sandberg and Tsoukas advanced sense-making to recognize that it's not just major crises that can jolt an organization. Where Weick was focused on major disruptions, Sandberg and Tsoukas says that minor changes can also create a need to change the way that organizations operate. Goya and Chittipaldi, as well as Pratt, looked at the ways that sense-making can occur. Sense-giving, according to Goya and Chittipaldi, occurs when organizational leaders try to influence the sense-making of stakeholder groups. And Pratt adds to this sense-breaking. Sense-breaking is the deconstruction of current identities, of existing meanings, in order to create new meanings through sense-giving. Finally, the last advancement to discuss was given to us by O'Leary and Chia. O'Leary and Chia says that in order to understand sense-making fully, we have to look at the context and the cultural environment in which it occurs. They developed the idea of the episteme in order to recognize that each organization has shared culture, values, and logic. And very often there are multiple epistemes that occur in any one organization. And if these epistemes are not in confluence with each other, if they are in conflict with one another, then that can have a significant impact on the sense-making process. Finally, to round out our understanding of sense-making, we'll look at a contemporary application just this past year by Rome and Isle. Rome and Isle were looking at the sense-making process in Israeli preschools. The Israeli preschools in the past year have lowered the age from 4 years to 3 years for children to come in. And this change in enrollment necessitated the inclusion of toilet training by the teachers. And this was an interruption to the normal routine, and it introduced ambiguity and uncertainty that had to be resolved because it did not coincide with the identity that the teachers had of themselves, because it introduced necessitated the introduction of toilet training, which hadn't been part of the process before. This inclusion of toilet training posed a challenge to the identity of the teachers because they saw toilet training as being inconsistent with who they were as teachers in the preschool environment. And if they were going to continue as preschool teachers, they had to adapt to this environment, this new situation, by breaking their old identity and creating a new identity. And they did this by establishing narratives with each other in order to create new identities, in order to incorporate toilet training, in order to see this not as a limitation on themselves as teachers, but as a new opportunity to teach children in different ways. Some teachers were successful at establishing new identities as teachers, incorporating toilet training, while others were not. And one of the reasons for this was widespread frustration that all teachers felt, because the organizational leadership did not play an active role here. This is the fragmented form of sense-making that Maitlis had introduced as an advancement of sense-making. And because it was fragmented, because leadership didn't play a role, the teachers themselves had to organize their new identities. Some teachers were more successful than others. These teachers that were successful incorporated this new identity and were able to make the transition to what the organization required of them. Teachers that were not able to make that transition, that could not create a new identity for themselves with the new demands on their role, then were not successful in the organization. And finally, the references that I used for my presentation. Thank you.